The Stalker. I've always loved hiking. Being alone in nature helps clear my mind, far away from the noise of the city. This time, I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far from any town or even other people. I was looking forward to the peace, the silence, and the chance to be alone with my thoughts. The hike to the cabin was long, much longer than I expected. The trail was rough, with fallen trees and slippery rocks that made every step a challenge. But the air was fresh, and the forest was quiet, except for the sound of my boots crunching on the ground. I didn't mind the difficulty. It made the arrival even more satisfying. When I finally saw the cabin, I was exhausted. It was a simple wooden structure, nothing fancy, but it looked solid. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, and the inside was cool and dark. I dropped my backpack on the floor, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. It was so quiet inside, almost too quiet. Something about the silence made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just because I was tired. I started to settle in, unpacking my things and getting the fire going. As the cabin warmed up, I began to relax, but then I heard it. A soft noise coming from the back of the cabin. It was faint, like someone moving, but I was sure I was alone. My heart started to pound in my chest as I listened. The noise came again, a little louder this time. It was like a shuffle, then a creak, as if someone was trying to move quietly. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, my hand trembling slightly, and walked towards the sound. I moved slowly, trying to be silent, even though every floorboard seemed to creak under my weight. When I reached the back room, I stopped, holding my breath. The door was slightly open, and I could see a shadow moving inside. I pushed the door open, shining the flashlight into the room, and that's when I saw him. A man, sitting on the bed, staring at me. His clothes were dirty, his hair tangled, and his eyes, they were wild, like he hadn't slept in days. For a moment, neither of us moved. I was too shocked to say anything, and he just kept staring at me, unblinking. "What are you doing here?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, as if he was trying to figure out what I was doing in his cabin. But this was my cabin. I had rented it. This didn't make sense. He stood up slowly, and I took a step back. He was taller than me, and there was something about the way he moved that made my skin crawl. He wasn't just a squatter. There was something more, something wrong. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and rough. My heart skipped a beat. How could he have been waiting for me? I didn't even know I was coming here until a few days ago. I tried to think of what to say, but my mind was blank, just filled with fear. He started talking again, describing things about me, personal things. He knew my name, where I lived, even small details about my daily life. He talked about how he had seen me walking to work, how he had followed me, watching me from a distance. My stomach turned as he spoke, each word making me feel more exposed, more trapped. "I know everything about you," he said, with a smile that made my blood run cold. I realized then that he had been following me for days, maybe even longer. He had planned this, waited for the right moment to confront me, and now I was trapped in this cabin with him. I needed to get out, but he was between me and the door. I tried to keep calm, to think of a way to escape, but he seemed to sense my fear. His smile faded and his eyes narrowed. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice hard and cold. "We're going to have some fun first." Panic surged through me, and I lunged for the door, but he was faster. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice, and pulled me back into the room. I struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. I could feel his breath on my neck as he held me close, whispering things in my ear that made me sick with fear. I knew I had to do something, anything, to get away. I kicked back with all my strength, hitting him in the shin. He grunted in pain and loosened his grip just enough for me to pull free. I ran for the door, not daring to look back, and burst out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running, even as branches scratched my face and rocks cut my feet through my thin shoes. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the trees, shouting my name, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Somehow, I made it back to the main road. A passing car saw me and stopped, the driver taking one look at my terrified face and throwing the door open. I jumped in, and we sped off, leaving the dark woods and that horrible cabin behind. I'm safe now, or at least I tell myself that. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can still feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. I moved to a new city, changed my job, even my name, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere. I'll never be able to forget his voice, his cold smile, and the way he looked at me like I was his prey. I'll never really be safe again. When we first found the cabin online, it seemed perfect. The photos showed a small, cozy place surrounded by thick trees, far from the noise of the city. It was cheap, too, which made it even better. We were 4 friends looking for a weekend getaway, and this cabin promised just that. The idea of escaping the daily grind and relaxing in nature had us excited. The drive to the cabin was long, winding deeper into the woods than we expected. The roads were narrow, barely more than dirt paths, but we didn't care. We laughed and joked, eager to start our vacation. The GPS finally announced our arrival, and there it was, just like in the pictures, but something felt different. It looked more run down in person. The windows were a little cracked, and the paint was peeling. There was a strange silence around the place, like the woods were holding their breath. We brushed it off, thinking it was just our imaginations running wild. We unpacked, settled in, and soon, the odd feeling faded away. We cooked dinner, had a few drinks, and talked late into the night. But as the sun set, the uneasiness returned. The darkness in the woods seemed thicker than usual, and every creak of the old cabin made us jump. I started hearing noises outside, faint rustling that seemed too deliberate to be animals, but I didn't want to scare anyone, so I kept quiet. That night, the power flickered a few times. Each time the lights dimmed, my heart raced. We joked about it, but the tension was real. It was after midnight when Mark, the most adventurous of us, decided to step outside to check things out. He claimed he wanted to make sure everything was fine, that it was just the wind or some animals causing the noise. We watched him from the window, his flashlight bobbing in the dark until it disappeared into the trees. Minutes passed, and he didn't come back. We called out for him, but there was no answer. Panic began to set in. We grabbed our phones trying to call him, but there was no signal. The landline in the cabin was dead too. We armed ourselves with kitchen knives and went out to search. The flashlight he had taken was on the ground near the edge of the trees, but Mark was gone. We saw signs of a struggle, trampled grass, a broken branch, but nothing more. We ran back to the cabin, locking the doors behind us. Fear gripped us, the kind that made it hard to think straight. In the morning, we searched the cabin for anything that might help us understand what was happening. That's when I found it. A hidden camera in the living room, barely noticeable. My hands shook as I called the others over. We searched the entire cabin and found more cameras, all hidden but all watching us. Then, in one of the bedrooms, we found photos, pictures of us, taken without our knowledge, from the moment we arrived. That's when it hit us. This was no random cabin. It was a trap. Our panic turned into full-blown terror. We knew we were being watched and that whoever had taken Mark was still out there, waiting. We barricaded ourselves inside, but it felt pointless. The killers knew this cabin, knew these woods, and they were toying with us. We could feel their eyes on us, waiting for us to make a mistake. As the day dragged on, the cabin turned from a safe place into a prison. One by one, my friends started to break. Sarah insisted that one of us was working with them, that this was some sick game. Her accusations tore us apart, and we began to turn on each other. Trust was gone, and with it, our chance of making it out alive. I tried to keep everyone calm, but inside, I was losing it too. Every noise, every shadow felt like death closing in. By nightfall, only 2 of us were left. Everyone else had been picked off, taken in the dark while we tried to sleep or when we dared to step outside. Desperation set in, and I knew we had to make a run for it. But as we tried to leave, we found the roads blocked by fallen trees, our car's tires slashed. The phones were still dead, and every move we made seemed anticipated, as if they were leading us right where they wanted us. In the end, it was just me. I knew they were playing with me, but I had to try something. I used what I had learned, tried to think like them. I found a hiding spot in the woods, a place where I thought I could wait them out. But as I sat there, heart pounding, I realized it was useless. They knew these woods, knew this game, and they were never going to let me leave. Just as I was about to make a run for it, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there they were, smiling like it had all been a fun little game. I don't remember much after that, just the feeling of cold steel, the sound of my own scream, and then nothing. I'm writing this now, not sure if anyone will ever read it, but if you do, stay away from those too-good-to-be-true deals online. Some places are cheap for a reason, and not every vacation ends with a happy memory. Some end in darkness, where no one will ever find you. I thought it was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, some peace and quiet in the woods, and a break from the city's noise. I had rented a cabin online, deep in the forest, far from everything and everyone. The directions seemed straightforward enough, but the closer I got, the more twisted the roads became. The turnoff wasn't even marked, just a narrow dirt path that didn't look like it led anywhere. But the GPS insisted this was the way, so I followed it. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that made the trees look like dark figures standing guard. I tried to reassure myself, but my grip on the steering wheel tightened. I must have driven for miles, the road getting rougher and the forest denser. No signs, no other cars, just the crunch of gravel under my tires. When the cabin came into view, it wasn't what I expected. It looked old, much older than the pictures online. The wood was weathered, the windows were dark, and the place seemed like it hadn't seen visitors in years. My first thought was to turn back, but the sun was almost gone and my phone had lost signal miles ago. I decided to knock, thinking maybe I could get directions. Maybe I was at the wrong cabin. I hesitated at the door, feeling a strange unease. Finally, I knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet woods. A moment later, the door creaked open, and a man peeked out. He looked rough. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Behind him, I could see a woman and a young girl, both just as frightened. They didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like I was some kind of ghost. "Please," the man finally whispered, "you need to leave. They'll be back soon." I felt a chill run down my spine. Who will be back? What's going on? "The hunters," he said, almost choking on the words. "They'll come for you too if you stay. You need to go now." I didn't know what to do. The fear in his voice was real, But where could I go? The road was long, and the night was coming fast. Can you tell me how to get out of here? I must have taken a wrong turn. The man shook his head. There's no time. They come at night, looking for anyone who finds this place. We were like you, just passing through. Now we're trapped. I didn't understand how they could be trapped. Why haven't you just left? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. We tried, the woman said softly, stepping forward. But they always find us. They hunt us like animals, like it's some kind of game. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded insane, but their fear was so raw, so real. I looked at the little girl who was clutching a worn-out stuffed toy, her eyes full of tears. My instincts told me to run, but I couldn't just leave them there. We need to go, I said. Together. We'll make it if we stick together. The man hesitated, then nodded. There's a path through the woods, but it's dangerous. We have to be quiet. They might already be watching. We waited until it was completely dark, the only light coming from a small, flickering lantern. My heart was pounding as we crept out the back door, the forest closing in around us. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept glancing at the man, wondering how he knew the way so well. Suddenly, we heard it, a low whistle, like someone signaling. The man froze, his face going pale. "They've found us," he whispered. Before I could react, the woman grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "Run!" she hissed. We sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at our faces, the ground uneven under our feet. I could hear footsteps behind us getting closer. Panic set in, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The girl was crying, the woman trying to keep her quiet. In the chaos, I realized something was wrong. The man and woman, they weren't scared like before. They were moving too fast, too sure of where they were going. I tried to shake off the thought, focusing on the sounds of the hunters getting closer. But then it hit me. The man was leading us straight into a trap. I stopped, trying to catch my breath. "Wait," I gasped. "Where are you taking us?" The man turned, his expression changing from fear to something colder, more calculated. "It's too late," he said, almost regretfully. "They're here." Before I could process his words, the woman lunged at me, her hand clamping over my mouth. I struggled, but she was stronger than she looked. The man just watched, his face hard, as if he'd done this before. I heard them before I saw them. The hunters, emerging from the darkness like shadows with faces. They weren't wearing masks, but their expressions were twisted with some sick pleasure. I tried to scream, but the woman's hand held tight, muffling my voice. The man spoke to the hunters, like he knew them. This one was easy, not much of a fight. One of the hunters, tall with a cruel smile, stepped forward. "You've done well," he said, looking me over. "But you know the deal. No loose ends." The man nodded, and I saw the realization in his eyes just as one of the hunters raised a gun. The last thing I heard was a single shot and the man crumpling to the ground. They left me there, tied up and gagged, the man's lifeless body next to me. The woman and the girl walked away with the hunters, disappearing into the night. I was the next part of their game, their twisted sport. I didn't have much time left. I knew they would come for me soon, to finish what they started, and there was no one around to hear me scream. The Lost Hiker. I've always liked hiking alone. It gives me time to think, to clear my mind. I've done it for years without any problems, but today was different. I decided to explore a remote trail, one that wasn't on any map I could find. It felt like an adventure, something to break the routine. The day started perfectly. The sun was shining, the sky was clear, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I felt free, even invincible as I walked deeper into the woods. After a few hours, the trail became less clear. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and rocks. I kept going, confident I'd find my way back. But soon, I noticed something strange. I hadn't seen any trail markers for a while. I tried to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. The forest was like a maze, and panic started to creep in. By the time I realized I was lost, the sun was already setting. The light was fading, and with it, my confidence. My phone had no signal, and the battery was draining fast. I felt stupid for not bringing a map or a compass, but it was too late for that. I had to find shelter before it got dark. That's when I saw it. A cabin, half hidden by the trees. Relief washed over me. I wasn't sure how long it had been since I last saw another person, but the thought of finding someone, anyone, made my heart race with hope. As I got closer, though, I noticed strange things around the cabin. There were traps on the ground, like the kind used for animals, but they were big enough to catch something larger. The smell of something rotten hung in the air, making my stomach turn. Still, I had no other choice. I had to take my chances. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. The windows were covered with thick curtains, blocking out what little light was left. I searched for a switch, but there was no electricity. I found an old oil lamp on a table and lit it, casting a dim, flickering light around the room. The place was bare, with just a bed, a small stove, and a few pieces of furniture. Everything looked old, like it hadn't been used in years. But it was the details that bothered me. There were knives on the wall, sharp and clean, as if someone had just polished them. A pile of worn clothes sat in the corner, stained with dark spots that looked like blood. And on the table I saw maps with trails marked on them, trails that I recognized. It hit me then. This wasn't just some abandoned cabin. Someone lived here, someone who knew these woods well, and not in a good way. My mind raced with questions. Was this person dangerous? Were they watching me right now? I couldn't stay, but I didn't know where else to go. I started looking for something, anything that could help me figure out where I was or how to get out of there. In a drawer, I found a stack of old newspapers. The headlines made my blood run cold. They were all about hikers who had gone missing in these woods, their bodies never found. One article, in particular, caught my eye. It was about a serial killer who was believed to be hunting in these parts, targeting hikers who wandered off the beaten path. The killer had never been caught. My hands shook as I realized the truth. I was in the killer's lair. I heard footsteps outside. My heart stopped. There was no time to think, only to act. I blew out the lamp and hid in the closet, barely daring to breathe. Through the slats, I could see a shadow moving in the room. The door opened and a figure stepped inside. I couldn't make out their face, but they moved with a calm confidence, like they belonged here. They walked around, checking things, but they didn't seem to notice anything wrong. I prayed they wouldn't hear the pounding of my heart. After what felt like an eternity, they left. I stayed in the closet, afraid to move, waiting for the sound of their footsteps to fade away completely. When I was sure they were gone, I slowly opened the door. The room was empty, but I knew I had to get out of there fast. I grabbed a knife from the wall, just in case, and slipped out of the cabin as quietly as I could. The forest was pitch black, and every sound made me jump. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stop. My mind was in a state of panic, imagining the killer right behind me. I ran through the woods, stumbling over roots and branches, not caring about the pain. I just wanted to get as far away from that cabin as possible. But the forest was unforgiving. I kept running, but every direction seemed to lead me deeper into the darkness. I couldn't tell if I was getting closer to safety or just more lost. My breaths were ragged, my legs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. Then I heard it, a twig snapping behind me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and sweat dripped down my face. I was not alone. I didn't dare turn around. I stood there, in the middle of the dark forest, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. The sound of footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. I'm not sure how this will end. Maybe I'll make it out, or maybe I won't. All I know is that I'm not alone in these woods, and I'm running out of time. I needed to get away from the noise. The city, my job, all of it. It was eating me alive. So when I found this silent retreat online, it felt like a lifeline. A week in the woods, no talking, no phones, just peace. It sounded perfect. The photos showed a cozy cabin surrounded by trees, far from anyone or anything. The reviews were glowing, but they all mentioned how life-changing it was. I booked it without thinking twice. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures, but there was something off about the place. It was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that relaxes you, but the kind that presses on your chest. I pushed that thought aside. This was what I wanted after all, silence. There were 5 other people at the retreat, all strangers. We were told to keep to ourselves, no talking, just meditating and reflecting. The first night, I settled into my room, trying to embrace the stillness. But as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. The others weren't just silent, they were too silent. They moved around the cabin in a way that felt synchronized, like they didn't need to speak because they already knew what the others were thinking. I told myself I was being paranoid. This was just my city brain struggling to adapt, but the next day things only got weirder. We were supposed to meditate together in the main room, sitting in a circle. But when I glanced around, I saw the others were making small gestures with their hands, almost like sign language, but not quite. Their eyes would meet, and they'd give these tiny nods, like they were agreeing on something I wasn't part of. I tried to ignore it, but my unease grew. That night, unable to sleep, I started to look around the room they had given me. In the back of the closet, I found an old, worn journal. The cover was faded, and the pages were yellowed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started to read. The entries were from years ago, written by someone who had stayed at the retreat. They wrote about a group that used the cabin for rituals, dark rituals. At first, I thought it was fiction, something the previous guest had written for fun, but as I read more, the descriptions matched what I was seeing. The way the group moved, the hand signals, it was all in there. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a retreat. The people here, they were part of some kind of cult. And the journal hinted at something worse, sacrifices. The writer talked about how they had barely escaped with their life, warning anyone who found the journal to leave immediately. Fear tightened my throat. I had to get out. But the cabin was miles from anywhere, and my car was parked at the end of a long, winding road. I decided to leave first thing in the morning, but that night I hardly slept. Every sound, every creak made my heart race. In the morning, I packed my things quietly, trying not to draw attention. I went to the kitchen where one of the others was already sitting. I couldn't keep it in anymore. I had to warn someone. I whispered, breaking the silence, asking if they knew about the journal. Their heads snapped up, and they stared at me with wide eyes. Then slowly, they raised their hand and made one of those gestures I had seen. Within seconds, the others appeared, as if summoned. I backed away, panic flooding my body. No one spoke. They just watched me, their eyes cold and empty. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked on it, desperate, but it was locked tight. I tried the windows, locked too. My mind raced. They had planned this. I was the sacrifice. I had no choice. I had to confront them. I turned around, heart pounding, and demanded to know what they were planning. One of them, the man who had been in the kitchen, finally spoke. His voice was calm, too calm. He said they were cleansing their souls, and mine would be next. That was it. I bolted for the back door, hoping it wasn't locked like the others. I slammed into it, and by some miracle, it opened. I stumbled out into the woods, running as fast as I could. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps closing in. The trees were thick, the ground uneven, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept going until I couldn't hear them anymore. I found a spot to hide, crouching down behind a thick bush, trying to quiet my breathing. I didn't dare move. The darkness pressed in around me, and I strained to listen for any sound, any sign that they were still following me. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually I heard something. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, getting closer. My heart pounded in my ears as I pressed myself further into the bush, hoping they wouldn't see me. The footsteps stopped right in front of me. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Then, silence. I waited, but nothing happened. Slowly, I peeked through the branches. There was no one there, but I knew better than to believe I was safe. I'm still out here, hiding. I don't know if they've given up or if they're still searching. All I know is I can't go back to that cabin. I can't trust anyone. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever find a retreat like this one, no matter how peaceful it seems, don't go. It's not worth it. Some silences are deadly. When I took the job as the caretaker of the old cabin, it seemed like an easy way to make some extra money. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any town, and the owner needed someone to watch over it during the off-season. I had no reason to say no. It sounded peaceful, just me, nature, and a quiet place to think. But when I got there, things didn't feel right. The first thing I noticed was the cabin itself. It was in good shape, considering it was old and had been empty for a while, but there were signs that someone left in a hurry. A bag was left on the floor near the door, half packed with clothes and a few personal items. A jacket was thrown over a chair like someone tossed it there without thinking. The air inside felt heavy, like something was hanging in the room, something unfinished. As I unpacked, I found a note on the kitchen counter. The handwriting was messy, almost like the person was shaking while writing it. It read, "If you're reading this, leave now. They come at night. Don't let them in." That was all. No explanation, no name, just those chilling words. I laughed it off, thinking it was some kind of joke. The previous caretaker must have been a bit paranoid, or maybe they were just trying to scare the next person who took the job. The first few days were quiet. I spent most of my time cleaning, fixing little things around the cabin, and taking walks in the woods. The forest was thick, with trees so tall they blocked out most of the sunlight. It was easy to get lost, but I liked the solitude. At night, though, the cabin felt different. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside made my skin crawl. Then, one night, I heard something that I couldn't ignore. It was late, maybe around midnight. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But then I heard voices, low, murmuring voices, like people whispering just outside the window. My heart started racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the wind was playing tricks on me. But when I got up to check, there was no one there. The night was still, the trees unmoving, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I found something that sent a shiver down my spine. There were footprints outside, leading up to the windows and then back into the woods. They were large, too large to be mine, and there were several sets of them. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. My mind raced with thoughts of the note, the warning. Was it possible someone, or something, was really out there? I tried to tell myself it was just some local kids playing a prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched only got worse. I started noticing little things inside the cabin that were off. The front door, which I always locked, would be slightly open in the morning. Objects on the shelves would be moved, not much, just enough for me to notice. I felt like I was losing my mind, like the cabin itself was playing tricks on me. Then, one night, I saw them. It was late again, the same time as before. I heard the footsteps first, then the whispers. But this time, I didn't check. I stayed inside, peeking through the curtains. They were there, shadows moving between the trees, getting closer to the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there were more of them than I had thought. 5, maybe 6 men. They were all dressed in dark clothes, their faces hidden by the shadows. They moved quietly, like they'd done this before. Panic set in. I grabbed the note from the kitchen and reread it. The words seemed to taunt me, reminding me that I was alone, isolated, with no way to call for help. I couldn't stay in the cabin, but I couldn't run either. The forest was thick, and I knew they would catch me before I made it far. My only choice was to hide, to try and keep them out. I started barricading the doors and windows, pushing furniture against them, anything to make it harder for them to get in. But the men were getting closer, their voices louder, more confident. They knew someone was inside. They knew I was trapped. The first knock on the door made me jump. It was soft, almost polite, like they were asking to be let in. Then the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I backed away, clutching a knife I'd found in the kitchen, but I knew it wouldn't help. The door shook as they pounded on it, the sound echoing through the cabin. My heart raced as I realized this might be it, that I might not make it through the night. The last thing I remember is the sound of the door starting to give way, the wood splintering under the force of their blows. My mind was a blur of fear and panic as I backed into a corner, waiting for them to break through. And then, nothing. Silence. The door still held, but for how long? I don't know what happened after that. Maybe they left. Maybe they're still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't know if I'll survive the night, but if anyone finds this, heed the warning. Don't stay in the cabin. They always come back. I'm not sure how much time I have left. The knocking has stopped, but the fear hasn't. I can still feel them out there, watching, waiting. I don't think I can take much more of this. If you're reading this, please just leave. Don't make the same mistake I did. The last guest. I needed a break. Life had been too much lately, and when I found that cabin resort online, it seemed perfect. A luxury getaway, hidden in the woods, far from the noise of the city. The pictures showed cozy cabins with fireplaces, private hot tubs, and stunning views of the mountains. I booked it without thinking twice. A week of peace sounded like heaven. When I arrived, the place was just as beautiful as the photos, maybe even better. The trees were tall, the air was crisp, and the cabins looked like something out of a magazine. But something felt off from the start. The parking lot was empty. I thought maybe it was just because it was off-season, but it still felt strange. As I got out of the car, a man appeared from the main lodge. He was dressed in a sharp uniform, smiling widely. too widely. "Welcome to the resort. You must be our guest," he said, almost too cheerfully. He grabbed my bag before I could say anything, leading me to my cabin. The place was stunning inside, perfectly clean, everything in its place, but there was something too perfect about it, like it hadn't been touched in a long time. "You'll be the only guest this week," the man said as he handed me the key, "so you'll have all the privacy you want." His smile never dropped, and I could feel his eyes on me as I walked inside. At first, I thought having the whole place to myself would be nice. No noisy neighbors, no interruptions. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The staff was everywhere. Every time I stepped outside, someone was there, asking if I needed anything, offering to bring me dinner or light the fireplace. Their attentiveness was unsettling. I started to wonder if they had anything else to do. That night, I tried to relax by the fire, but my mind kept drifting back to the odd things I'd noticed, like the fact that the main lodge's door was always slightly ajar, even when no one seemed to be inside, or how I hadn't seen a single other guest, not even at check-in. The quiet was starting to get to me. The next morning, I decided to explore the grounds. I hoped a walk would clear my head. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were other cabins, all identical to mine, but they looked empty. The curtains were drawn tight, and there was no sign of life inside. Yet the paths were well tended, and the grass was neatly trimmed. It was like the whole place was staged, waiting for someone who never arrived. I couldn't stop thinking about the emptiness. Where were the other guests? If this place was so popular, why was I the only one here? My thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind me. "Enjoying your stay?" It was a woman this time, another staff member, smiling that same too wide smile. I hadn't even heard her approach. "Yeah, it's peaceful," I lied. She nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. "Let us know if you need anything," she said, before walking away. As she did, I noticed something. Her uniform was immaculate, but her shoes were muddy, like she'd been walking through the woods. But there wasn't a speck of dirt on the paths around the resort. That evening, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. I decided to do something I probably shouldn't have. I started looking around. The lodge seemed like a good place to start. I waited until after dark, when the staff seemed to disappear. The door creaked as I pushed it open, but no one came. Inside, it was dark and silent. Too silent. I found a small office near the back, the door slightly ajar. Inside, I saw paper scattered on the desk, as if someone had left in a hurry. I picked up a few of them, my heart racing. They were guest logs, but the names were all crossed out. No checkout dates, just blank spaces where they should have been. And then, at the bottom of the pile, I found something worse. A list of names with the word "missing" next to each one. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned, but no one was there. My hands were shaking as I put the papers back. I needed to leave, now. But as I stepped out of the office, I saw shadows moving in the hallway. The staff, their smiles gone, their eyes cold, were blocking my way out. I tried to act calm, thanking them for their help, saying I was just looking for some extra blankets. They didn't say anything, just watched as I backed away and hurried back to my cabin. Once inside, I locked the door and grabbed my things. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I knew I couldn't stay, but when I peeked out the window, I saw them. The staff was outside, standing in the dark, just watching my cabin. I knew I had to get out, but how? My car was parked near the lodge, and I would have to go past them to get to it. I didn't have any other choice. I grabbed my keys, took a deep breath, and quietly opened the back window. The woods were dark, but I knew the general direction of the parking lot. I kept to the shadows, my steps as silent as I could make them. Every rustle of leaves made me freeze, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. When I finally saw my car, I felt a flicker of hope. But then I saw them. The staff was standing by the lodge talking quietly. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was serious. I used the noise to cover my steps, inching closer to my car. Just as I reached it, one of them turned, his eyes locking onto mine. I didn't wait. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and slammed on the gas. They started running towards me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back until I was far from the resort, the trees blurring past. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I called the police, told them everything, but when they went to the resort, they found nothing. The cabins were empty, the staff gone, and there was no sign of the place I described. Sometimes, I wonder if it was all in my head. But every night, I dream of those cold eyes watching me, and I wake up in a sweat, the memory of that place as real as the day it happened. I don't know if they're still out there, but I can't shake the feeling that they are, and that one day, they'll find me again. I recently inherited a cabin from a distant relative, someone I never knew existed until the letter arrived. It felt like a strange kind of luck to suddenly own a place without ever asking for it. I guess you could say I was curious. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods. Getting there was harder than I expected. Narrow dirt roads winding through trees that seemed to close in on me the deeper I drove. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the shadows were already stretching long. The cabin looked old, forgotten. The wood was dark and worn, the windows clouded with dirt. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation, the fact that no one had been here for years. But I told myself it was nothing, just my nerves. I was alone, after all. Once inside, I started looking around. The air was stale and the floor creaked with every step. It was just a single room with basic furniture, an old sofa, a table, a few chairs. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with dusty, forgotten books. It was like stepping back in time, into someone else's life. One bookshelf caught my eye. It was different from the others, larger and placed oddly against the wall. Something about it didn't seem right. I don't know what made me do it, but I reached out and pushed. The shelf moved with a groan, revealing a narrow door behind it. My heart started to race. This wasn't just an old cabin, it was hiding something. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door. The hinges screamed as it swung inward, revealing a small, dark room. My hand shook as I reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered and died, leaving me in near darkness. The little bit of light from the main room was enough to see by, though. Inside, the room was filled with old furniture, dusty chairs, a small table, and a pile of boxes stacked in the corner. But what really caught my attention were the photographs on the wall. At first I thought they were just old family photos, but as I looked closer, my stomach twisted. The photos were of people, men, women, even a child, each one with a look of terror frozen on their faces. They were tied to chairs, their eyes wide with fear. I turned away, bile rising in my throat, but then I saw the tapes. A stack of old VHS tapes sat on the table, each one labeled with dates. My hands trembled as I picked one up. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't stop myself. I found an old TV and VCR in the corner and plugged them in. The screen crackled to life, and I pressed play. The video was grainy, but the sound was clear. The same people from the photos were on the screen, alive and begging for their lives. I couldn't watch, but I couldn't look away either. The sound of their cries echoed in the tiny room, filling my head with their fear. When the tape finally ended, I felt sick. I stumbled out of the hidden room, desperate to get away, but the cabin didn't feel safe anymore. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floor made me jump. I needed to leave, but when I reached the door, it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, or maybe it was something else, but I couldn't get it open. Panic started to set in as I tried the windows, but they were stuck too. Then I heard it, a sound outside, like footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. Someone was out there, watching. I ran to the window, peeking out from behind the curtain, but I saw nothing. Just darkness and trees. My mind was racing. I couldn't stay here, not after what I'd seen, but I couldn't leave either. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, holding it tight in my shaking hand. If someone was out there, I had to be ready. But the minutes ticked by, and nothing happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, I thought. Maybe I was overreacting. But then I heard it again. This time, a soft, low voice, almost a whisper coming from just outside the door. "You're not leaving," it said, calm and steady. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door, the knife shaking in my hand. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay, but I couldn't leave. I felt trapped, like the cabin itself was closing in on me. The voice spoke again, closer this time, almost right behind me. "You're next." I spun around, slashing the air with the knife, but there was no one there, just the empty room, silent and still. But I knew I wasn't alone. Someone was here, waiting, just like they had for those people in the photos. In that moment, I realized the truth. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a trap, and I had walked right into it. The hidden room, the photos, the tapes, it was all part of it. I was just the latest victim, caught in a nightmare with no way out. I don't know how long I stayed there, knife in hand, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed, maybe even days, but the voice never came back. I was left with nothing but the fear and the knowledge that I wasn't alone. When I finally found the strength to try the door again, it opened easily, as if nothing had ever been wrong. I ran to my car and didn't look back, but the cabin still haunts me. I can't stop thinking about what I found there, and I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching, waiting for their next victim. If you ever inherit a place from someone you've never met, be careful. You might not be as lucky as I was. I never liked the idea of going to that cabin. Maybe it was just the way it looked in the photos. Old, almost falling apart. But my friends insisted it would be fun. A real adventure, they said. I wasn't sure if it was fear or just a bad feeling, but something kept telling me this trip would be different from the others. Still, I didn't want to be the one to ruin it, so I packed my things and joined them. The drive up to the cabin was long, the road winding through thick forest that seemed to swallow us whole. When we finally arrived, my unease only grew. The cabin was even worse in person. The wood was rotting in some places, and the windows were covered in dirt. The place felt abandoned, like it had been waiting for someone or something for a long time. But my friends laughed it off. "It's just for a few days," they said. "What could go wrong?" That first day we went hunting. I'm not much of a hunter, but I followed along. The woods were dense and quiet, almost too quiet. It felt like the trees were watching us, waiting. We didn't talk much as we walked, the silence broken only by the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. By the time we headed back to the cabin, I was tired, and all I wanted was to sit by the fire and forget about the strange feeling in my gut. When we got back, everything seemed normal at first. But then we noticed the door wouldn't open. At first, we thought it was just stuck, but then one of my friends, Tom, went around the side of the cabin and saw it. The doors and windows had been nailed shut. Someone had been here while we were gone. Panic set in fast. We were trapped, locked inside with no way out. My heart pounded as we tried to pry the boards off, but they wouldn't budge. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. My friends tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear in their eyes. Who would do this? Someone whispered, but no one had an answer. As night fell, the cabin seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in on us. We decided to stay together, not knowing what else to do. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. That's when we noticed it. Scratches, deep and uneven, like someone had carved words into the wood. They were hard to read at first, but as we looked closer, the messages became clear. "No escape," one said. Another read, "You're next." The words sent a chill down my spine. We tried to keep our minds busy, looking for something, anything that might help us escape. But every plan failed. The door stayed shut, the windows too. It was as if the cabin itself didn't want us to leave. And then we started hearing things, footsteps on the roof, whispers outside the walls. We tried to tell ourselves it was just the wind, maybe an animal, but deep down, we knew better. The tension inside grew. I could feel it, the way my friends looked at each other, at me. We were all thinking the same thing, but no one wanted to say it out loud. One of us had to be behind this. There was no other explanation. But who? And why? The whispers got louder, closer. Someone or something was out there, watching, waiting. It wasn't until the next day that the truth came out. We were sitting in the main room trying to come up with another plan when Tom snapped. He started yelling, accusing everyone of being the one who trapped us. We all denied it, but Tom wouldn't listen. He pulled out his hunting knife, his eyes wild with fear and something else, something darker. That's when it all clicked. Tom had done this. He had planned it from the start. The cabin, the nails, the scratches. It was all him. I don't know why. Maybe he wanted to see us suffer, or maybe he just wanted control. But now it was too late to stop him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly, the cabin didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like a tomb. Tom's outburst led to a fight, and before I knew it, he was on the floor, blood pooling around him. The knife, once in his hand, was now in someone else's. I don't even remember who stabbed him first. Maybe it was me. The room spun. The walls seemed to close in even more. There was no way out, not anymore. After that, nothing was the same. We couldn't trust each other, not with Tom's body lying there, a grim reminder of what we were capable of. The whispers outside grew louder, closer. The footsteps became more frequent. We were out of time, and we knew it. In a last, desperate attempt to escape, I found a way out. The back door, hidden behind a stack of old wood, wasn't nailed shut like the others. I don't know why. Maybe Tom had planned to use it himself, but it didn't matter. I ran, not looking back, not even when I heard the others screaming. The forest swallowed me up, the trees like silent witnesses to my escape. But as I stumbled through the woods, I realized something. I was alone, miles from help, and the footsteps were still behind me. Closer now. I didn't have to turn around to know someone was there, someone who had been waiting for me to run, waiting for me to be alone. Now I sit here, writing this, knowing they're still out there, somewhere. Maybe they're reading this right now, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started. I went to the cabin in the mountains to get away from everything. Life in the city had become too noisy, too stressful. I needed silence, a place where I could hear my own thoughts. The cabin seemed perfect. It was small, surrounded by thick trees, with a view of the valley below. The nearest town was miles away. and I felt a strange comfort in the isolation. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The sky was turning a deep shade of orange, and the wind had started to pick up. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, but there was also a strange feeling in the air. It was too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off as nerves from being alone. I had always been a bit jumpy, especially in new places. I brought in my bags, lit a fire, and tried to settle in. The cabin was cozy, with old wooden furniture and a small kitchen. There was no internet, no phone signal, just a radio that crackled with static when I turned it on. I didn't mind. I had brought some books and planned to spend my time reading and relaxing. As night fell, the wind outside grew stronger, howling through the trees. I made myself some dinner, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer than they should, and every creak of the cabin made me jump. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just the unfamiliar setting playing tricks on my mind. Then there was a knock at the door. I froze. Who could be out here in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen anyone on the road up, and the cabin wasn't exactly easy to find. The knock came again, more urgent this time. My heart was pounding as I walked to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. When I opened the door, a man stood there. He was in his mid-30s with messy hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. His eyes were wide with fear and he was shivering, even though it wasn't that cold. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I need help. I'm on the run. They're after me." I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to slam the door and lock it, but something in his eyes stopped me. He looked desperate, like a cornered animal. I hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. He thanked me over and over as he stumbled into the cabin, collapsing onto the couch. I asked him what happened, but his answers were vague, fragmented. He kept saying he was innocent, that the police were after him for something he didn't do. He claimed he had been running for days, hiding in the forest, but now they were closing in on him. He was exhausted, his words barely making sense. I didn't know if I should believe him, but he seemed too scared to be lying. As the night went on, I couldn't relax. The man's presence filled the small cabin with tension. He paced back and forth, muttering to himself, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. I watched him closely, trying to figure out if he was telling the truth, but the more I listened, the more his story didn't add up. He kept changing details, contradicting himself. When I questioned him, he became defensive, almost angry. That's when I started to get really scared. What if he wasn't running from the police? What if he was dangerous? I realized I had no idea who this man was or what he was capable of. The cabin suddenly felt very small, the walls closing in on me. I needed to stay calm, to think. I decided to keep playing along, pretending to trust him while I planned my next move. I quietly started to prepare, hiding a knife in the kitchen where I could reach it quickly, making sure I knew where the exits were. Every time he turned his back, I watched him, waiting for him to slip up, to give me a reason to act. But the longer I waited, the more the tension grew. He was unpredictable, one moment panicking, the next eerily calm. It was like being trapped in a cage with a wild animal, not knowing when it might lash out. Finally, it happened. He must have sensed my fear, because he suddenly turned on me, accusing me of trying to betray him. His eyes were wild, his face twisted with anger. He lunged at me, and I barely had time to grab the knife. We struggled, crashing into the furniture, knocking over the lamp. The only light left was the dim glow of the fire as we fought for control. I don't remember much of the fight, just flashes of pain and fear. Somehow I managed to get the upper hand, pushing him back and slamming the door behind me as I fled into the night. I ran through the dark forest, not caring where I was going, just wanting to get as far away from the cabin as possible. When I finally stopped, the sky was starting to lighten. I was alone, cold and bleeding, but I was alive. I looked back, half expecting to see him coming after me, but there was nothing but silence. I didn't go back to the cabin. I kept walking until I found a road and flagged down a car. I told the driver I had been attacked by a stranger in the mountains. He called the police, and they searched the area, but they never found the man. I don't know what happened to him, if he's still out there, hiding in the forest, or if he's moved on to another cabin, another victim. I try not to think about it, but sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he's still looking for me. If one day I'll hear a knock at my door and it will be him, smiling, ready to finish what he started. I didn't mean to find myself in that cabin, but the storm gave me no choice. I was driving back from a weekend trip when the sky turned dark and the rain started coming down like a waterfall. The road became almost invisible and my car was getting harder to control. When I saw the small cabin off the side of the road, I didn't think twice. I needed to get out of the storm. The place was old, probably abandoned, but it looked like it would keep me dry. I parked as close as I could and ran inside, feeling the cold rain soak through my clothes. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was as I expected, dusty, with old furniture, and a single lamp flickering on a table. The wind howled outside, making the walls tremble. I locked the door behind me and tried to settle in, though the place felt far from welcoming. The floor creaked under my feet, and the air was thick with the smell of damp wood. I pulled off my wet jacket and sat down, hoping the storm would pass quickly. The night dragged on, and the rain only seemed to get worse. The sound of it pounding against the roof was almost deafening, and the wind kept rattling the windows. I couldn't relax. Something about the cabin made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, there was a loud knock at the door. I froze. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in this weather? The knock came again, harder this time, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. I got up slowly, every nerve in my body on edge, and approached the door. I hesitated with my hand on the handle, my mind racing with possibilities. What if it was someone dangerous? But what if it was just someone like me, looking for shelter? I opened the door a crack, just enough to see who was there. A man stood on the porch, drenched from head to toe. His clothes clung to his body, and his hair was plastered to his face. He looked desperate. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. "My car broke down nearby. I just need to get out of the rain." I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to close the door and lock it, but something in his eyes made me pause. I nodded and stepped aside, letting him in. As he passed, I caught a whiff of something foul, but I couldn't tell if it was him or just the damp cabin. He moved to the fireplace, trying to warm himself. I stayed near the door, not wanting to get too close. The more I watched him, the more uneasy I felt. He kept pacing, muttering under his breath. His eyes were wild, darting around the room like he was expecting someone to jump out at him. "Thanks for letting me in," he said after a while, though he didn't sound grateful. There was something off about him. I tried to make small talk, asking him about his car, but his answers were vague, almost like he wasn't really listening to me. The storm raged on outside, making it impossible to leave. I was stuck here with this stranger, and every minute that passed made me more anxious. I tried to remember if I had heard anything on the news about escaped convicts or dangerous criminals, but nothing came to mind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As the hours dragged on, the man's behavior got stranger. He kept glancing at the door like he was waiting for someone or something to come through it. His pacing turned into frantic movements and his muttering grew louder. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but it didn't sound good. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's really going on here? You're acting weird." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and the silence was worse than the storm outside. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react before he pulled a knife from his coat. The blade glinted in the dim light, and I felt a surge of panic. This was it. I was going to die here, in this God-forsaken cabin. But something in me snapped. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy metal poker from the fireplace, and swung it at him. The impact was solid, and he staggered back, clutching his arm. I didn't stop. I swung again, hitting him in the side, then the head. He crumpled to the floor, the knife clattering out of his hand. I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the man who had just tried to kill me. Blood trickled from his head, and he wasn't moving. The storm still howled outside, but it was nothing compared to the noise in my head. I felt dizzy, sick, like I was going to pass out. I stumbled to the door and opened it, letting the cold, wet air wash over me. The rain had slowed, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. I stood there, soaking in the silence, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was he really a convict? Or was he just a man driven mad by the storm and isolation? I didn't know, and I didn't care. All I knew was that I had survived. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't. Even now, the memory of that night haunts me. The storm, the stranger, the blood. It's all too real, too vivid. And every time it rains, I hear that knock on the door and I wonder, what if I hadn't opened it? I wasn't supposed to be in that cabin, but I needed a break, and my friend said it would be perfect. Quiet, peaceful, she had said, just what you need. She didn't mention the blizzard that would trap me there. The first night wasn't so bad. The wind howled outside and the cold tried to sneak in, but the cabin held up. The fire crackled and I felt almost cozy. The silence inside was a welcome change from the city noise. But there was something off. It was too quiet, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation. But then I started hearing noises, small, almost too faint to notice at first. Creaks and groans from above. I laughed it off, thinking it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind playing tricks. But the attic, I had a weird feeling about it from the start. The door to the attic was in the hallway, just above the staircase. I hadn't even thought about going up there. What would be the point? It was probably full of dust and old junk, things left behind by the cabin's previous owners. On the second night, the noises grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just the house settling. There was a pattern, like someone or something was moving around up there. I tried to ignore it, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it. Shuffling, like footsteps, or maybe dragging something across the floor. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The storm outside got worse. The wind battered the windows and snow piled up, blocking the door. I was trapped, and so was whatever, or whoever, was in the attic. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. The sounds were constant now. Every time I tried to sleep, they would start again, louder and more deliberate. I felt watched, paranoid. Things started to go missing, small things at first. My keys, a knife from the kitchen. I found my phone under the couch, even though I knew I left it on the table. I started to question everything. Was I losing my mind? Was it just the isolation playing tricks on me? Finally, I decided to confront it. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The door to the attic loomed above me, more like a shadow than a door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but I forced myself to turn it. The door opened with a groan, and the smell hit me first. Damp, stale air mixed with something rotten. I hesitated but stepped inside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dust and old furniture. But then, in the corner, I saw it. A pile of blankets, a small stash of food, and a notebook. My heart raced as I approached the pile. Someone had been living here. For how long? I picked up the notebook, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with scribbles, plans, and drawings. My name was written several times, alongside disturbing notes about me, my habits, what I did each day. This person had been watching me. I heard a noise behind me and spun around. A figure stood in the shadows, barely visible in the dim light. I froze, fear rooting me to the spot. The person moved, slowly stepping into the light. Their face was gaunt, eyes wide with a twisted sort of excitement. They had been waiting for this moment. "You shouldn't have come up here," the voice was hoarse, like they hadn't spoken in days. I wasn't ready yet. Ready for what? I didn't want to find out. I bolted for the door, but they lunged at me, grabbing my arm. I struggled, my fear turning into desperate strength. I managed to break free, shoving them back into the darkness. I slammed the attic door shut and locked it, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. But I wasn't safe. The storm outside was still raging, and I was alone, trapped in this cabin with a maniac who had been planning something for me. I sat by the door, listening. The attic was silent again, but I knew they were still up there, waiting. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time seemed to stretch in the silence. Then I heard it. Not from the attic this time, but from the floor below. A soft creak, like a footstep. They were downstairs now. How? I locked the door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no time to think. They were in the cabin with me, and I had nowhere to go. I grabbed the fireplace poker, the only weapon I could find, and crept down the stairs. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the dying fire. I could barely see, but I could hear them, moving slowly, methodically, like they were searching for me. I knew I had to act before they found me. I moved as quietly as I could, holding my breath, trying to stay calm. I saw their shadow in the kitchen, their back turned to me. This was my chance. I raised the poker, ready to strike, but at the last second they turned around, their eyes locking onto mine. They smiled, a slow, terrifying grin that sent a chill down my spine. I swung the poker, but they were fast, too fast. They dodged and lunged at me, knocking the poker from my hand. We struggled, but they were strong, stronger than I expected. I felt their hands around my throat squeezing, and I knew I was losing. My vision blurred, and I started to fade. But then, another sound, this time from upstairs. We both froze, eyes wide in shock. There was someone else in the cabin. Taking advantage of their distraction, I broke free and ran for the front door. I didn't care about the snow or the cold. I just needed to get out. I pulled the door open and stumbled into the blizzard, the freezing air cutting through me like a knife. I didn't look back. I just ran, hearing nothing but the wind and my own ragged breathing. Finally, I collapsed in the snow, too exhausted to continue. But the last thing I heard before everything went black was a voice, a whisper from the cabin, calling my name. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, safe but scarred. The police said they found no one in the cabin, just my things scattered around, as if I had left in a hurry. They didn't believe my story, and maybe I don't either. But every time I close my eyes, I hear that voice, calling my name, waiting for me to return. I never expected a weekend getaway to turn into a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened. My spouse, Sarah, suggested we spend some time at her family's cabin. She said it would be peaceful, a break from our busy lives. I agreed, thinking it would be good for us. But now, I wish I had never stepped foot in that place. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any town or people. It had been in Sarah's family for generations, and she spoke about it with pride. When we arrived, I felt a mix of excitement and unease. The cabin was charming in a rustic way, but there was something off. Maybe it was the way the trees crowded around the cabin, their branches almost touching the roof. Or maybe it was the smell, something musty and damp, like the place had been closed up for too long. As we settled in, I noticed little things that didn't sit right with me. There were stains on the wooden floor, old and dark, like they had been there for years. The walls seemed to creak more than they should, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Sarah brushed off my concerns, saying it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. The next day, while Sarah was outside chopping wood, I decided to explore the cabin. It was small, with only a few rooms, but something pulled me to the living room. The floorboards felt uneven under my feet, and as I walked around, I noticed a loose plank near the fireplace. Curious, I pried it up, revealing a hidden door beneath. My heart raced as I lifted the door, revealing a dark hole leading down into the ground. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I found a flashlight and climbed down into the cellar. The air was thick and cold, and I could barely see anything in the dim light. The cellar was small, more like a pit than a room, and it smelled of earth and something metallic. As I moved the flashlight around, it landed on a pile of tools in the corner. They were old and covered in rust, but I could see the dark stains on them. Blood. I froze, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. There were also pieces of clothing, torn and dirty, and what looked like bones scattered around. My stomach turned, and I felt a wave of nausea. I had to get out of there. I climbed back up, slammed the door shut, and covered it with the plank. My hands were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. When Sarah came back inside, I tried to act normal, but I knew I had to say something. "Sarah," I started, my voice trembling. "I found something in the cabin. A cellar, under the floor. There's blood and old tools. What is this?" She looked at me with a blank expression at first, then her face twisted into something I had never seen before. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice sharp. "You're imagining things. There's nothing down there." But I could see it in her eyes. She was lying. "I'm not imagining it, Sarah. I saw it with my own eyes. What is going on here?" She glared at me, her hands clenching into fists. "You weren't supposed to find that," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "It's a family secret, something we've kept hidden for years." My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you mean, a family secret? What have you done?" She looked away, her jaw tight. "My family. They used to bring people here, strangers. They would lure them in, and then things happened. Bad things. It's been going on for generations." I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. "And you? Are you part of this?" Sarah didn't answer right away. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were cold. "It's in our blood. It's what we do. And now, you know too much." Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there, but I couldn't let her see how scared I was. "Sarah, we need to leave. We can't stay here." I tried to keep my voice calm, but I could feel the terror creeping in. She shook her head, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "You're not going anywhere. You should have stayed out of that cellar." I bolted for the door, but she was faster. She grabbed my arm and threw me back. "You're not leaving," she hissed. "Not until this is over." I knew I had to fight. I struggled against her, trying to break free, but she was strong, stronger than I ever realized. I managed to push her off for a moment, long enough to make a run for the door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking, but just as I thought I had a chance, she was on me again. We fought, and I could feel her desperation, her madness. She wasn't going to let me leave. I had to do something. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and swung it at her head. She stumbled back, dazed, and I didn't wait to see if she was okay. I ran out of the cabin and into the woods. I didn't stop running. I didn't know where I was going, just away from that place. But even as I ran, I could hear her voice in my head, telling me that it wasn't over, that it would never be over. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way back to the road. I flagged down a passing car and they took me to the nearest town. I told the police everything, but when they went back to the cabin, they found nothing. The cellar was gone, covered up like it had never existed. And Sarah, she was gone too. Now, I'm left wondering if it was all real, or if I've lost my mind. But I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, watching, waiting. And I know one thing for sure: I will never be the same. I want to share something that happened to me a few months ago. It still haunts me, and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm not even sure if anyone will believe me, but I need to get it out. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it. So, here it goes. I've always loved camping. There's something about being away from everything, surrounded by nature, that just feels right. I've been doing it for years, always looking for new spots. I'm careful too. I plan, I check the weather, and I always make sure someone knows where I'm going. But this time, I didn't. I was stupid, and I guess I wanted an adventure. It started when I overheard a conversation at a local outdoor shop. Two guys were talking about this hidden cabin deep in the woods. They called it a real gem, a place where no one would bother you. They said it was off the grid, totally isolated, perfect for someone who wanted to get away from it all. That someone was me. I asked around a bit, trying to get more information, but no one seemed to know much. It was like a secret, passed only between those who were in the know. The idea of it intrigued me more and more. I thought it would be a perfect weekend getaway. No phones, no people, just me and nature. So, I packed my gear and decided to go for it. The drive out was longer than I expected. The roads became narrower, the trees denser. It was exactly what I was looking for. I finally found the turnoff, a barely visible dirt road that led even deeper into the forest. After about an hour of bumping along the rough path, I reached the cabin. At first glance, it was everything I'd hoped for: small, wooden, surrounded by trees. But as I got out of the car, I couldn't shake this strange feeling. The place was too quiet, almost like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to brush it off as nerves. After all, I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. I unloaded my gear and went inside. The cabin was simple, just one room with a bed, a small kitchen, and a table. It was a bit more run down than I expected, dusty with cobwebs in the corners. But I didn't mind. I told myself it added to the charm. But as the day went on, that uneasy feeling grew. I kept hearing noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But whenever I looked, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just animals. But then I noticed something odd. A chair that I hadn't touched was moved, just slightly, from where it had been earlier. And later I found my flashlight on the bed when I was sure I'd left it on the table. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. Night came fast, and with it, a heavy darkness. There were no lights out there, no moon, just pitch black pressing in on the cabin. I tried to sleep, but every little sound had me on edge. The wind outside picked up, and the trees creaked and groaned like they were alive. That's when I heard it. A soft, slow, scraping sound against the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, like something was being dragged across the wood. I wanted to believe it was just a branch blown by the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I stayed awake the whole night, clutching a knife I had brought for cooking. Every noise outside seemed louder, closer. I thought about leaving, but I couldn't make myself go out into the dark. I told myself I'd wait until morning. When the first light finally came, I packed my things as quickly as I could. But when I opened the door, I froze. There were footprints in the dirt, right outside the cabin. They weren't mine. Someone had been there, watching me. I felt sick. I realized then that I'd been lured here, that someone had wanted me to come. I had no cell service, no way to call for help, and I was miles from anywhere. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think, to get out of there. But as I stepped out of the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a series of traps, hidden just off the path I had driven in on. They were simple, but effective. Someone had been preparing for me. I turned back to the cabin, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't just run. Whoever it was knew these woods better than I did. I needed a plan. I decided to use the cabin itself. I would make it seem like I was still inside, waiting in the dark while I found a way out. I set up a few things to make it look like I was sleeping. My sleeping bag rolled up under the blanket, the flashlight propped up to cast a shadow. Then I slipped out the back, careful not to make any noise. I moved as quietly as I could through the trees, hoping I wouldn't step on one of those traps. I didn't get far before I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, like whoever it was knew exactly where I was. I felt a surge of terror, but I kept moving. The footsteps got closer, and I could hear the breathing now, low and heavy. I knew I couldn't outrun them. I had to outsmart them. I found a spot where the trees were thick and the ground was uneven. I hid there, crouching low, waiting. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard a voice, calm and cold. It was the person who had been following me, calling out to me, taunting me. They knew I was there, hiding, and they were enjoying it. I waited, not moving, barely breathing. The voice kept talking, closer now. Then I heard a snap, a trap, right where I had been a moment ago. I had led them into their own trap. There was a sharp cry, followed by silence. I didn't wait to see what had happened. I ran, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands shaking on the wheel. I made it out, but I don't feel safe. I keep thinking about what happened, about how close I came to not making it out of those woods. And I wonder how many others didn't. When I found the cabin listing online, it seemed perfect. A small town far away from the city, surrounded by trees and quiet. I wanted a break, somewhere I could relax, think, and maybe get some writing done. The photos showed a rustic but cozy cabin. It was old, yes, but that just added to the charm, or so I thought. The drive there was long and winding, but when I finally arrived, I felt a strange mix of calm and unease. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, only a bit more tired. The wood was weathered, and the windows were slightly dirty, like they hadn't been cleaned in a while. I told myself it was just the rural atmosphere. It was peaceful, but something about the place made me feel off. The first day was quiet. I settled in, unpacked my things, and took a walk around the property. The town was a short drive away, and the locals were friendly enough, though their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. When I asked for directions to the nearest store, they were helpful, but there was a stiffness in their voices, like they were hiding something, or maybe just uncomfortable with outsiders. I noticed they all exchanged quick looks when they thought I wasn't looking. That night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of the forest, branches moving, animals scurrying, but this was different. It was like something was moving around the cabin. I got up and looked out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in a new place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I went outside to check. There were strange marks on the ground, like someone, or something, had been walking around the cabin. They were deep, almost like the ground had been dug up in some spots. My mind went to wild places, thinking of animals or maybe even people. I decided to investigate, hoping to find a logical explanation. With a small shovel I found in the shed, I started digging near the largest of the marks. It didn't take long before I hit something hard. I cleared away the dirt, and there it was, an old, unmarked grave. My heart skipped a beat. It was just a small wooden box, but the sight of it filled me with dread. I didn't open it. I couldn't. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be inside, but I forced myself to stop. Maybe it was just a pet, something harmless, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Later that day, as I was trying to forget about what I'd found, there was a knock on the door. A man stood there, old and tired looking, his eyes serious. He didn't introduce himself, just stared at me for a long moment before speaking. He told me, in a low voice, that I needed to leave the cabin. I asked him why, but he wouldn't give me a straight answer. He just said, "It's not safe here. You should go back where you came from." His words sent chills down my spine, but when I asked more, he just repeated himself and left, disappearing into the trees. I didn't want to believe him. I tried to tell myself he was just some crazy old man, but I couldn't ignore the fear that had taken root in my chest. That night, the noises outside were louder, closer. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. But when I tried to leave, things started going wrong. First, the car wouldn't start. The engine made a sick grinding noise before dying completely. I checked everything I could, but nothing worked. The road leading out of town was blocked. A tree had fallen right across it, like it had been placed there on purpose. I tried another route, but the same thing happened. Another tree, another dead end. It felt like the town itself was trying to keep me here. The people in town had changed too. Their polite smiles were gone, replaced by cold, blank stares. When I tried to ask for help, they ignored me or quickly changed the subject. They were hiding something, something to do with the grave. I was sure of it. I started to notice more. Whispers when they thought I wasn't listening, the way they avoided the topic of the cabin. I was beginning to think I was never going to get out of here. Desperation took over, and I went back to the cabin, determined to find out what was going on. I started searching for anything that might explain the grave, anything that would give me a clue. That's when I found an old newspaper hidden under a loose floorboard. The articles were old, yellowed with age, but the stories were clear. Missing people, strange deaths, all linked to this cabin. The grave outside was mentioned, though never in detail, only that it was best left undisturbed. That night, as I sat in the dark, trying to make sense of everything, the noises started again, louder and more menacing. I knew then that whatever was happening, I was in danger. I needed to leave, but every exit seemed blocked, every path a dead end. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no way out. The town wouldn't let me leave, and neither would the secrets buried here. As the noises grew closer, surrounding the cabin, I felt the walls closing in on me. I was trapped, with no one to turn to, no way to escape. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of the front door creaking open and a cold, heavy presence filling the room. I don't know if anyone will read this or if it will just become another part of the town's dark history, but if you're ever in a small town looking for a quiet retreat, be careful where you go. Some places are meant to be left alone, their secrets buried for a reason. When I booked the cabin, it was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from everything. The Airbnb listing looked perfect, a cozy cabin in the woods, far away from the city noise. I was tired, and I needed this. So, when I got the confirmation from the host, I packed my things and drove there as soon as the weekend started. I arrived late, the sun already down, and the sky was a deep blue turning to black. The address the host gave me led to a place deep in the woods, far from any other houses or roads. I remember thinking it was a little too quiet, but I brushed it off. I told myself that's what I wanted, a quiet weekend alone. The cabin looked different from the photos, older and more worn down. The paint was peeling, and the windows were covered with dirt. I hesitated for a moment, but I figured it was just the lighting, or maybe old photos in the listing. The host's reviews were good, so I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been opened in a while. The first thing I noticed was the dust everywhere. It didn't make sense because the host said they cleaned it before I arrived. I walked further in, the floor creaking under my feet, and I saw a plate of food on the kitchen table. It looked like someone had been eating there not long ago. The food was spoiled and moldy, which made me feel uneasy. Who would leave food like this if the cabin was supposed to be empty and cleaned? I went into the bedroom next, and that's when the real panic started to set in. There were clothes in the closet, men's clothes, dirty and crumpled. On the bed, I found a suitcase that wasn't mine. It was half open, with more clothes spilling out. It was clear that someone was staying here, recently too. But where were they now? I grabbed my phone to call the host, but there was no signal. I started to freak out a little. That's when I got a text from the host. It read, "I'm so sorry, but I gave you the wrong address. The cabin you booked is a few miles away. You must be at the wrong one. Please leave and head to the correct address." My heart sank. If I was at the wrong place, then whose cabin was this? My mind raced, thinking about the clothes, the food, the general feeling that someone was just here. And then I heard it. The sound of voices outside, faint at first, but growing louder. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly moved to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtains. There were men outside, at least 3 of them. They were walking towards the cabin, carrying large, heavy-looking bags. My first thought was that maybe they were the owners of the cabin, and I could explain the mistake. But then I saw what was in the bags: guns and drugs. I backed away from the window, trying to be as quiet as possible. This was no ordinary mistake. I had walked into something very dangerous. I needed to get out of there, but how? The front door was the only exit, and it was too close to the men. I decided to wait, hoping they would go away, but then I knocked over a chair. The sound echoed in the small cabin, and I heard the men stop talking. I heard one of them say, "Did you hear that?" My blood ran cold. I had to move. They would find me if I stayed. I tiptoed to the back of the cabin, hoping there was a window I could climb out of. I found one in the bathroom, small but just big enough for me to squeeze through. I pushed it open as quietly as I could, the rusted frame screeching a little. I winced at the noise, praying they didn't hear it. I climbed through, dropping down into the bushes outside. I started to crawl away from the cabin, keeping low to the ground. I didn't know where I was going, just away from there. The forest was dark, and every little sound made me jump, but I kept moving. I could hear the men inside the cabin now, their voices getting louder as they searched for whoever had made the noise. I tried to move faster, but the underbrush was thick, and I tripped, falling hard. I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out in pain. I could hear them coming out of the cabin now, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were looking for me. I scrambled to my feet and started running. I couldn't see where I was going, just running blindly through the trees. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. I could hear them behind me getting closer. Finally, I saw the road up ahead. I almost cried with relief. I stumbled out of the trees, waving my arms, hoping a car would come by and see me. As if on cue, headlights appeared in the distance coming towards me. I stood in the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The car slowed down as it got closer, and I thought I was saved. But as it pulled up next to me, I saw who was inside. One of the men from the cabin was sitting in the passenger seat, staring right at me. The door opened, and I knew I was out of time. I turned to run, but I felt a hand grab my arm, pulling me back. The last thing I remember was the smell of sweat and dirt, and then everything went black. I woke up in the back of the car, my hands tied. I don't know where they're taking me, and I don't know if I'll ever make it out of this alive. If anyone reads this, please be careful with where you book your next trip. Not every cabin in the woods is safe, and not every mistake can be fixed. It started as a simple plan, just a weekend getaway. My friend Jake found this cabin online, deep in the forest, far from the noise and rush of the city. He told me it would be the perfect place to unwind, with no phones, no work, just nature. We both needed it. Life was getting too stressful. The drive took longer than we expected. The forest was thicker than I imagined, and the road was barely more than a dirt path by the time we got close. Jake seemed to know where we were going, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trees felt too close, and there was a weird silence, like the forest was holding its breath. We arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting. It was old, the wood darkened with age, but Jake was excited. He said it had character. The first thing I noticed was the door. It looked like it had been fixed recently. The wood around the lock was newer, not weathered like the rest of the cabin. I didn't think much of it then. I should have. Inside, the cabin was simple. A couple of chairs, a table, and 2 small beds. We set our stuff down, and Jake started a fire in the old stone fireplace. We ate dinner, talking about nothing important, just enjoying the quiet. But as the night wore on, I felt uneasy. The silence outside wasn't peaceful. It was too quiet, like the forest was waiting for something. When I finally fell asleep, it was restless. I woke up several times, convinced I heard something outside. A rustle, a soft crunch, like footsteps. But whenever I listened closely, there was nothing. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a fox. Jake was snoring in the next bed, completely at ease. Morning came, and I woke up to an empty cabin. Jake's bed was neatly made, but he was gone. At first, I didn't panic. Jake was an early riser. Maybe he went for a walk. But as the minutes passed and he didn't come back, I started to worry. His backpack was still here, along with his phone. That wasn't like Jake. He never left without his gear. I went outside, calling his name, but there was only the quiet forest. I looked around the cabin, my heart pounding. Where could he have gone? It wasn't until I saw the footprints that I knew something was really wrong. They led away from the cabin, into the trees. They were fresh, not yet blurred by the wind or animals. I followed them, my mind racing with all the things that could have happened. Maybe he was in trouble. Maybe he was lost. Maybe someone took him. The forest felt more hostile with every step I took. The footprints led me deeper into the woods, to a small clearing. There was a campsite, but it wasn't normal. There were ropes on the ground, a roll of duct tape, and a map spread out on a tree stump. My stomach turned when I saw the map. It had several spots marked, including our cabin. This wasn't an accident. Jake didn't just wander off. He was taken. I felt sick, my mind screaming at me to run, to get help. But I couldn't just leave him. I had to do something. I couldn't live with myself if I left him out here. I grabbed one of the ropes, feeling the roughness under my fingers, and started following the trail further into the woods. The sun was getting higher, but the trees were so thick it barely made a difference. Everything felt darker, the shadows longer. I heard voices in the distance, low and rough. I dropped to the ground, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. I crawled closer, keeping to the thickest part of the underbrush. Through the branches, I saw them, 3 men, dirty and rough-looking, standing around a van. And there, tied up and gagged, was Jake. He was slumped against a tree, his eyes wide with fear. I had to act. I couldn't think. If I thought, I'd freeze, and Jake would be gone. I gripped the rope tighter and moved closer, every step feeling like it took hours. The men were busy loading something into the van, not paying attention to Jake or the forest around them. When I was close enough, I threw the rope around the nearest man's neck and pulled with everything I had. He went down hard, struggling to breathe, but I didn't let go. The other 2 turned, shocked, and I knew I had seconds before they'd be on me. I grabbed a rock and threw it at the next man's head, praying it would buy me time. He stumbled, cursing, and I ran for Jake. Jake's eyes were wild with panic as I fumbled with the knots, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them loose. The men were shouting now, getting closer. Finally, the ropes fell away, and Jake ripped the gag from his mouth, gasping for air. "Run!" I shouted, dragging him to his feet. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, the men right behind us. I didn't dare look back, just kept running, pulling Jake with me. The forest blurred around us, the trees whipping by as we ran for our lives. I could hear them gaining on us, their footsteps getting louder. But then, up ahead, I saw the path, the dirt road we drove in on. If we could just make it there, we might have a chance. We burst onto the path, our legs burning, lungs on fire. The van roared behind us, the men shouting, but we kept running. Somehow, we made it back to the car, throwing ourselves inside just as the van skidded to a stop behind us. The engine roared to life, and we tore down the dirt road, leaving the men and the cabin behind. But even as we drove away, the sound of footsteps echoed in my mind, and I knew we weren't safe. Not really. I needed to finish my book. The deadline was close, and I had been struggling for weeks. I couldn't think clearly in the city. Too much noise, too many distractions. So, I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from everything. It was cheap, isolated, and perfect, or so I thought. The cabin was exactly as described. Small and cozy with old furniture that smelled like wood and dust. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books. It was quiet, just the sound of wind rustling through the trees. I told myself this was what I needed. A place where I could focus, away from everyone. But from the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the furniture seemed a little too perfectly arranged, like someone had taken great care to make it look casual. Or maybe it was the way the air felt heavy, like I wasn't really alone. I ignored the feeling, brushing it off as nerves. For the first few hours, everything was fine. I unpacked my things, set up my laptop on the small wooden desk in the corner, and started to write. But soon my attention drifted. My eyes kept wandering around the room, feeling like something was out of place. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus, but the feeling only got stronger. That's when I saw it, a small black dot in the corner of the living room ceiling. I thought it was a bug at first, but when I got closer, I realized it wasn't a bug at all. It was a camera. My heart skipped a beat. Why was there a camera in the living room? I looked around the cabin, my skin crawling with a cold fear I couldn't explain. Slowly, I started searching the cabin, my hands shaking as I moved through the rooms. And that's when I found them. More cameras, hidden in places you wouldn't think to look. Behind the books on the shelf, inside the kitchen cupboard, even in the bathroom. I felt sick. Someone had been watching me the whole time. I could almost feel eyes on me, following my every move. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and ran outside to my car, but when I tried to start it, nothing happened. It wouldn't even make a sound. The engine was dead. That's when my phone buzzed. I looked down to see a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Going somewhere?" My blood ran cold. Whoever was watching me knew I was trying to leave. I was trapped, and they were toying with me. I ran back into the cabin, locking the door behind me, as if that would help. My mind was racing. Who was doing this? Why? I needed answers. I started searching the cabin again, this time for anything that could give me a clue. I opened drawers, flipped through the old books on the shelves, and searched the dusty attic. Finally, I found something. Hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace, there was a small metal box. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and a few handwritten notes. The articles were about people who had gone missing, all of them last seen in or near the cabin. The photographs showed the cabin from different angles, some taken from inside, others from the woods around it. The notes were chilling, full of details about the people in the photos, their habits, their routines, what they did before they vanished. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. This was a game, a sick game that someone was playing, and I was the latest pawn. They had been watching me since I arrived, and now they were waiting for the right moment to make their move. I couldn't stay there. I had to leave, even if it meant going through the woods on foot. I smashed every camera I could find, hoping that would give me some time. I packed a bag with whatever I could carry, put on my heaviest coat, and left the cabin, not looking back. The woods were dense, the trees close together, their branches clawing at me as I pushed through. The night was cold, and I couldn't see the moon through the thick canopy. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I knew they were still watching me, even out here. I could feel it, that same heavy feeling in the air. I walked for what felt like hours, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was exhausted, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop, not until I was far away from that cursed cabin. But just when I thought I was getting close to a road, my phone buzzed again. Another message. "You can't run from what you can't see." I froze. I looked around, but all I could see were trees, stretching out endlessly in every direction. I was alone, or so it seemed. But that message, it was like they were right behind me, watching me, laughing at my fear. I started running, not caring where I was going, just wanting to get away. Finally, I stumbled out onto a narrow road. Relief washed over me as I saw headlights approaching in the distance. But even as I flagged down the car, a dark thought crept into my mind. Was I really safe? Was this really over? Or were they still watching me, waiting for the next part of their sick game? As the car stopped and I climbed inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that somewhere, hidden in the shadows, another camera was pointed right at me, recording every move I made. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. I didn't think twice when Mike invited me to his family's cabin for the weekend. We had been friends for years, the kind of friendship where you don't expect surprises. So, when he said he had a cabin deep in the woods, far from town, I thought it would be a perfect getaway. A break from the usual grind, some fresh air, and just hanging out with a good friend. The drive was long, but the scenery was nice, trees everywhere, and the sky was clear. The cabin itself was small and old but cozy, with a warm wooden feel. It stood alone, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. There was no one else around, and I felt the peaceful isolation the moment we stepped out of the car. Mike seemed different, more relaxed, almost too eager for us to get inside. I shrugged it off as excitement. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. The kind of silence where you can hear every creak, every rustle. I'm used to city noise, so it felt strange. I told myself it was just the new place messing with my head. The cabin was charming in a rustic way. Old furniture, dim lights, and a fireplace that filled the room with a soft orange glow. We had a few beers, talked about nothing important, and by midnight, we decided to call it a night. But even as I lay in bed, something didn't feel right. The bed was uncomfortable, or maybe it was the room itself. The shadows seemed too dark, the silence too deep. There was this odd mirror on the wall facing the bed. I found myself staring at it, feeling like someone was on the other side, watching. I must have fallen asleep eventually, though, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Day 2 was supposed to be for exploring. Mike suggested a hike, but I wanted to check out the cabin a bit more first. Something about the place still felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even when I was sure Mike was outside. While looking for something to eat, I noticed the clock in the living room wasn't just a clock. There was a small lens inside, almost invisible, but definitely a camera. My heart pounded as I quickly looked around the room, spotting more of them. Inside the smoke detector, the TV, even the mirror in my room. Every direction I turned, I found another hidden camera, each more cleverly disguised than the last. My mind raced. Why would Mike have cameras all over the cabin? I wanted to confront him, but fear took hold. What if there was more to this than I understood? Maybe I was overreacting, but then again, who hides cameras in a place like this? I couldn't trust him now, not without knowing more. When Mike came back inside, I tried to act normal, but I could tell he noticed something was off. He watched me carefully, like he was waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, his smile seemed to stretch just a little too far, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment too long. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I decided to leave, but Mike wouldn't hear it. He insisted I stay another night, that I was just tired from the trip. His tone was friendly, but there was something else underneath it, something I couldn't ignore. I made an excuse to go to the bathroom, needing a moment to think. When I came out, I noticed my phone wasn't where I left it. Mike had moved it, or maybe he had taken it. I didn't know, but I was sure now that something was very wrong. I waited until after dinner to make my move. I told Mike I was going to bed early, needing rest for the drive back in the morning. He seemed to buy it, but I wasn't sure. I locked the door to my room, which I knew wouldn't hold him if he really wanted to get in. My hands shook as I packed my bag as quietly as I could, praying he wouldn't hear. Around midnight, I heard him outside my door, whispering something I couldn't make out. My heart was pounding so loud I thought he might hear it. I knew I had to leave, now or never. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the window, sliding out into the cold night. I could hear Mike still talking softly to himself, or maybe to me, through the door. I didn't wait to find out. The woods were pitch black, the trees towering like dark shadows around me. I ran as fast as I could, branches scratching my face, my breath coming out in quick gasps. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away as possible. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. Mike was chasing me, his voice calm but with an edge that terrified me. "You can't leave. You know that. It's too late," he called out, his words making my skin crawl. I stumbled, falling hard onto the ground, dirt filling my mouth as I tried to scream. I managed to get up and keep running, my legs burning with every step. I thought I saw a light in the distance, maybe a road, maybe someone who could help. But as I got closer, the light vanished, and I realized it was just another trick of the darkness. Finally, I reached what I thought was a clearing, only to find myself back at the cabin, standing where I started. The front door was open, and Mike was standing there, smiling that same stretched smile, like he knew I would end up back here. "Welcome back," he said, and I knew I was trapped. I tried to run again, but something hit me from behind, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my bed, the cameras still watching, Mike sitting beside me, his face calm, but his eyes cold. "You're not going anywhere," he whispered, and I knew he was right. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. I never should have wandered off the trail. It's the first rule of camping, right? But there I was, caught up in the peace of the woods, letting my curiosity take over. I just wanted to see what was beyond the bend, where the trees grew thicker and the sounds of the forest seemed to quiet down. The clouds were moving in fast, and I knew I had to set up camp soon. But that's when I saw it. A cabin. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. A cabin out here, miles away from the main trail. But there it was, tucked between the trees like it had been forgotten by time. The wood was old, gray, and worn, the kind of place that feels wrong just by looking at it. I should have turned back. My tent was back on the trail, not far from where I left it, but a storm was coming, and the cabin was right there. I told myself it was safer than getting soaked out in the open. Plus, I was curious. Who wouldn't be? The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, the sound cutting through the quiet like a scream. Inside, it was dark, with only a bit of light coming through the dirty windows. It smelled of mold and something else I couldn't place. The air felt heavy, like the cabin was holding its breath. I nearly walked out right then, but then I saw the journal. It was sitting on a small table near the back of the cabin next to a blood-stained knife. I froze. The knife was the first real sign that something was wrong, that I wasn't supposed to be here. But I picked up the journal anyway, my hands shaking. The first few pages were normal enough. The guy who wrote it, some hunter or hiker, seemed normal too. He wrote about the weather, the woods, what he'd seen that day. But as I kept reading, the tone changed. He started writing about feeling watched, like someone was out there in the trees, following him. At first, he thought it was an animal, but then he became sure it was a person. Someone was out there, he wrote, and they weren't friendly. The last few entries were barely readable. His handwriting had become messy, the words spilling over the lines. He was losing it, convinced that this person, or people, were closing in on him. The last entry was short, just a few sentences, but it chilled me to the bone. He was going to kill them, he wrote. He was going to end it before they got him. And then the writing stopped. I put the journal down, my heart racing. The cabin was suddenly too quiet. The storm had started outside, rain pounding on the roof, but inside it was like the world was holding its breath. I needed to get out of there. I ran to the door, but when I pulled it open, my heart nearly stopped. My camping gear, everything I'd left back on the trail, was scattered across the porch. My backpack was torn open, its contents strewn about. My tent was slashed to pieces. Someone had been here. Someone had found my camp and followed me to the cabin. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the knife from the table, my only defense, and backed away from the door. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind howling through the trees. I couldn't see anything outside, just darkness and rain. But I could hear it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I shut the door, locking it, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The cabin suddenly felt like a trap, a cage I'd willingly walked into. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to control my breathing, trying to think. My mind was racing, flipping through the journal's pages in my head, trying to remember anything that could help. But all I could think of was that last entry. He was going to kill them. What if he hadn't? What if they'd killed him instead? What if they were still out there? The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I strained to hear, my ears searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the rain and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, a voice. It was low, almost a whisper, but I heard it clearly through the door. "I know you're in there." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't angry or loud. It was calm, too calm. I didn't respond, didn't move. I just tightened my grip on the knife, praying that they would go away, that they didn't know I was here. But the door handle rattled. They were trying to get in. I backed away, looking for a way out, but there wasn't one. The windows were too small, the back door nailed shut. I was trapped. The door shook as they tried to force it open. I could hear their breathing now, heavy and excited. They were enjoying this. They wanted to scare me before they got to me. I had one chance. When the door finally gave way, I'd have to fight. I wasn't strong and I wasn't brave, but I had no choice. I could hear the wood splintering, the door cracking under the pressure. My heart was in my throat, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the knife. And then, just as the door was about to break, everything went quiet. The handle stopped rattling, the footsteps stopped. Even the rain seemed to quiet down. I waited, every muscle tense, but nothing happened. Minutes passed. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then, slowly, I inched toward the door, knife raised. I had to see. I had to know if they were still out there. I peeked through the crack in the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The porch was empty. There was no sign of anyone. My gear was still scattered, the ground soaked with rain, but no one was there. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over, that they'd given up. But then I saw it. A single wet footprint on the floor inside the cabin, right behind me. The story ends there, leaving readers with a sense of dread and uncertainty about the narrator's fate. My partner and I needed this weekend away. We had both been stressed out for months, and the idea of a secluded cabin in the woods seemed perfect. No neighbors, no noise, just us. When we arrived, the cabin was exactly how we imagined it, small, cozy, and far from everything. It felt like a different world, a safe place where we could forget about our troubles. The first night, we settled in quickly, enjoying the quiet. We cooked dinner together, drank wine, and talked about everything and nothing. It was the kind of night that made all the stress seem worth it. But then, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard it. Footsteps. Outside. They were soft at first, almost like a deer walking through the woods, but then they got louder, closer. We both stopped talking, listening. My partner smiled and said it was probably just some animal. "We're in the woods after all," they said, trying to make me feel better. I nodded, trying to believe it too. But the footsteps didn't stop, and they didn't sound like an animal. I couldn't sleep that night. Every little sound seemed louder than it should be. The wind against the windows, the creaking of the old wood floors, even my own breathing. It all felt too loud, too close. But eventually exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was shining, and the woods looked peaceful. But when I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I noticed something strange. There was a cigarette butt on the ground near the cabin's door, and it looked fresh. It wasn't there yesterday. My partner doesn't smoke, and neither do I. "Maybe it's from the last people who stayed here," my partner suggested when I showed them. But they didn't sound convinced, and neither was I. Something about it felt wrong, but I didn't want to ruin the weekend by overthinking. So I let it go, even though it nagged at me. We spent the day hiking and trying to enjoy ourselves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following us. But there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the occasional rustle of leaves. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was starting to set. We decided to stay inside that evening, playing cards and trying to relax. But as the night grew darker, the sense of unease returned. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the game, but then my partner stopped mid-sentence, their eyes fixed on the window. "Did you see that?" they whispered. I turned to look, and for a moment I saw it too, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but it was there. My heart started to race. My partner stood up, peering out the window, trying to see more. "I'll go check it out," they said, grabbing a flashlight. "No, don't," I said. But they were already heading for the door. I followed them, not wanting to be left alone. We stepped outside, the night air cold against our skin. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal much, just the same trees, the same shadows. But then we heard voices, low and hushed, coming from somewhere nearby. My partner motioned for me to stay quiet, and we crept closer, trying to make out what they were saying. As we got nearer, the words became clearer and my blood ran cold. "Need to leave before they figure out we're here. We can't have anyone knowing about this place. We'll take care of it. No one's going to leave this cabin alive." I grabbed my partner's arm, pulling them back toward the cabin. We needed to get out of there, fast. But as we turned to leave, we heard a twig snap behind us. I looked back and saw a figure emerging from the shadows, a gun in their hand. "Run!" my partner yelled, and we bolted back toward the cabin, but it was too late. They were onto us. We barely made it inside before the first shot rang out. The bullet shattered the window, glass flying everywhere. My partner shoved a chair against the door, trying to buy us some time, but we both knew it wouldn't hold for long. "We need to get out," I whispered, my voice shaking. "They'll kill us if we stay." My partner nodded, their face pale. "There's a back door. Maybe we can sneak out while they're focused on the front." We moved quickly, trying to stay quiet, but every step seemed to echo in the small cabin. As we reached the back door, I heard footsteps pounding on the porch. They were trying to break in. My partner opened the door slowly, peeking outside. The woods were dark, but it looked clear. We slipped out, staying close to the side of the cabin, hoping the shadows would hide us. But as we started to move toward the trees, a flashlight beam swept across the yard. "There they are," someone shouted. We ran. Branches scratched at our faces, and the cold air burned our lungs, but we didn't stop. Behind us, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. We stumbled into a small clearing, and my partner turned to face me, their eyes wide with fear. "We're not going to make it, are we?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed their hand, pulling them toward a fallen log that might give us some cover. We crouched behind it, trying to catch our breath, trying to think of a plan. But before we could move again, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell over the woods, heavy and unnatural. I dared to peek over the log, and that's when I saw them. 3 men standing just a few feet away, their eyes scanning the trees. They hadn't seen us yet, but they were close, too close. I ducked back down, my heart pounding in my chest. My partner squeezed my hand, and I could feel their fear, their desperation. I knew we had to do something, but what? We were trapped, and they were armed. There was no way out. Suddenly, one of the men spoke, his voice low and threatening. "Come out now, and maybe we'll make it quick. Keep hiding, and you'll wish you hadn't." I looked at my partner, trying to figure out if we had any chance at all. But before I could decide, the log we were hiding behind started to move. The men had found us. The last thing I remember was the sound of a gun being cocked, the cold metal pressing against the back of my head. And then, everything went black. The road stretched out in front of me, long and empty, like it was leading to the end of the world. Trees surrounded both sides, their branches twisting into the darkening sky. The silence was thick, only broken by the hum of my engine. The cabin was supposed to be just ahead, hidden deep in the woods. I kept my hand steady on the wheel, even though my heart was racing. This deal had to go smoothly. It was my chance to finally make it, to prove I could handle bigger things. But something didn't feel right. My gut was screaming at me to turn around, but I couldn't. I needed the money too much. When the cabin came into view, my stomach tightened. It was old, worn down, with faded wood and a roof that looked like it could cave in at any moment. The windows were dark, no sign of life inside. I parked the car and sat there for a minute, trying to calm the nerves that were buzzing inside me. This was just another job. I'd been through worse. I told myself I could handle it. I had to. I got out of the car and walked to the door. It creaked open with a push, and the smell hit me first. Something metallic, sharp, and sickening. The kind of smell that sticks in your throat. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that's when I saw him. The buyer was lying on the floor, motionless. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the dusty wooden boards. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I had to get out of there, but before I could turn, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. It was open, just a crack, like someone had been watching and left in a hurry. I spun around to leave, but that's when I saw them. Figures moving between the trees, closing in on the cabin. They were wearing masks, plain white masks that hid their faces. My pulse sped up, panic setting in. They had me surrounded. I was trapped. My first thought was to run, but I knew it was useless. They had me cornered. My mind raced, trying to figure out who they were, what they wanted. This wasn't part of the plan. I wasn't supposed to be here with a dead buyer and a group of masked men hunting me down. My brain was shouting at me to find a weapon, something to defend myself with, but all I could find was an old rusty knife in the kitchen drawer. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The cabin felt like a maze, every turn leading to a dead end. There was no way out. The windows were nailed shut. The back door was locked from the outside. Whoever these people were, they wanted me here. I tried to think of who could have set me up. It had to be someone close, someone who knew about the deal. But who? My mind ran through names, faces, trying to figure out who would do this to me. The men were inside now, moving quietly, surrounding me. Their masks made it impossible to read their expressions, but their silence was what really got to me. They didn't say a word, just watched me, like they were waiting for something. One of them gestured for me to move, pointing toward the center of the room. I didn't have a choice. I moved slowly, keeping the knife hidden by my side, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. They pushed me around, making me play their sick game. Every time I thought I could make a break for it, they blocked my path, closing in tighter. They were toying with me, enjoying watching me squirm. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the walls closing in, trapping me. I tried to fight back, slashing at them with the knife, but they were too fast, too strong. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting it until I dropped the knife. Pain shot through my arm, but the fear was worse. I was losing. I could feel it. Then, out of nowhere, I realized who had betrayed me. It all made sense now. The strange look my partner had given me before I left. The way they insisted I go alone. How they knew every detail of the deal. They had sold me out, set me up to take the fall. Rage boiled up inside me, but there was nothing I could do. The masked men were closing in, their cold eyes watching me from behind those blank faces. I fought as hard as I could, managing to knock one of them back, but it wasn't enough. They overpowered me, pinning me to the floor. I could feel the cold of the wooden boards against my cheek, the smell of blood filling my lungs. I knew this was the end, but I wasn't going to go out without a fight. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes of movement, the sound of my own breathing, fast and desperate. The next thing I knew, I was lying outside the cabin, staring up at the sky. The night was quiet. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. The masked men were gone. I was alone. I don't know how I got out or why they let me live. Maybe they wanted me to suffer, to live with the knowledge that I'd been betrayed by someone I trusted. Or maybe they were still out there, watching, waiting to finish the job. I don't know. But every time I close my eyes, I see those masks, those cold, empty eyes staring back at me. And I know, deep down, that this isn't over. Not by a long shot. I woke up with my head pounding, eyes heavy and sore. Everything was dark. My arms felt like lead, and when I tried to move them, I couldn't. Panic shot through me as I realized I was tied to a chair. My wrists were bound tight, cutting into my skin, and my ankles were tied to the legs of the chair. I struggled against the ropes, but they didn't give an inch. The room smelled damp, like wet wood and old fabric. I blinked, trying to see through the dim light, but it was useless. I was trapped, alone in this strange place with no idea how I got here. My breathing grew louder in the silence. I tried to remember what happened, how I ended up in this nightmare. The last thing I remembered was being out with friends. We were at a bar, laughing, drinking. I closed my eyes, trying to focus. A flash of a stranger's face came to mind. A man, maybe, or a woman. The memory was hazy, like a bad dream. I felt like I should know, but everything was blurry, like I was looking through fog. As I sat there, my mind racing, I heard it. Footsteps. They were soft at first, then louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I heard the click of a lock turning, and then the door creaked open. A shadow stepped inside, tall and broad. I squinted, trying to make out the figure, but their face was hidden by a mask. They moved slowly, like they had all the time in the world. "Who are you?" I tried to ask, but my voice came out shaky, weak. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, they walked around me, their footsteps echoing in the small room. Finally, they spoke, their voice calm, almost soothing. "You don't remember, do you?" they said, their tone making my skin crawl. "You don't remember how you got here, or why?" I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. Fear clawed at me, growing stronger with every second. "You've been brought here because you have secrets," the figure continued. "Secrets you thought you could hide, but you can't. Not from me." A cold sweat broke out across my skin. My mind raced, trying to figure out what they were talking about. Secrets? What secrets? I couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there, fast. The figure leaned in closer, their breath warm against my cheek. "You've hurt people," they whispered. "People who trusted you. And now, it's time to pay." Their words hit me like a punch to the gut. Memories I tried to bury long ago began to surface. Pieces of a past I'd rather forget. Things I did, mistakes I made. I thought I had moved on, but this person, whoever they were, they knew. They knew everything. I tried to plead, to explain, but they didn't care. They kept talking, revealing more and more, each word like a blade cutting into me. The guilt, the regret. It was too much. I wanted to scream, to make it stop, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure stepped back, watching me with cold eyes. "You're going to stay here," they said, "until you understand what you've done, until you're ready to confess." I stared at them, my mind racing for a way out. But all I could think about was what they had said, about my secrets. How did they know? Who were they? The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing down, making it hard to breathe. After what felt like hours, the figure finally left, the door locking behind them with a heavy click. I was alone again, but their words echoed in my mind, taunting me. I had to get out. I had to escape, or I'd lose my mind. I watched the door, waiting, planning. Every time the figure came in, I studied them, looking for weaknesses. They were careful, never turning their back for too long, but I was desperate. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. The fear, the guilt, it was eating me alive. Then, one day, the figure left the door unlocked. I couldn't believe my luck. My hands were raw from trying to free myself, but I didn't care. I pulled at the ropes with all my strength, ignoring the pain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the knots loosened and my hand slipped free. I quickly untied the rest and stood up, my legs shaking. I knew I had to move fast. I crept to the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I peeked out, but the hallway was empty. I stepped out, my breath catching in my throat. I felt like a wild animal, every sound making me jump. I just needed to find a way out, and then I'd be free. But as I reached the end of the hall, I heard a voice. It was low, familiar, and it made my blood run cold. I stopped, frozen in place. The voice was coming from a room down the hall, a room with the door slightly open. I knew I shouldn't look, but something pulled me closer. When I reached the door, I peeked inside, and what I saw made my stomach drop. There, sitting in a chair, was someone I knew, someone I trusted. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This person, they were the one who did this to me. They were the one who knew my secrets, who wanted to make me pay. I stumbled back, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I thought I had escaped, but I was wrong. I wasn't free. I was trapped. And the worst part was, I didn't know if I could ever get out. The fear, the dread, it was all too much. And that's when I realized the truth. There's no escape from your past, no matter how far you run. It always catches up with you in the end. I needed to get away. After months of stress, I found a cabin for rent in a small town far from everything. The place looked perfect. a quiet escape. I didn't think twice about booking it. When I arrived, the town seemed almost too welcoming. People smiled too much, asked too many questions. They all seemed to know who I was, though I had never been there before. "You're staying at the old Miller cabin?" they'd ask, with a strange look in their eyes. But I brushed it off. Small towns are like that, right? Everyone knows everything. The cabin was cozy, just as the pictures showed. It was far from the main road, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The first night was peaceful, though too quiet. There were no sounds, no crickets, no owls, just silence. I thought maybe this was normal for such a remote place. The next morning, while putting away my things, I found an old newspaper stuffed in the back of a drawer. The date was from years ago, almost forgotten. The headline talked about a murder, a brutal one, that happened in the very cabin I was staying in. I read the article twice, my heart pounding harder each time. A couple had been killed, and no one was ever caught for the crime. I felt cold inside, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. People die in houses all the time. The rest of the day, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I went into town for supplies, the smiles seemed more forced, the questions more probing. "How are you liking the cabin?" they'd ask, leaning in a little too close. "Heard any strange noises?" That night, the quiet was broken. I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. My heart raced as I stood frozen, listening. But when I looked out the window, nothing was there. Everything seemed normal again. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, trying to calm myself. But then, I noticed little things inside the cabin were different. A chair moved slightly from where I remembered placing it. A door left ajar when I was sure I had closed it. My toothbrush wet, though I hadn't used it yet that morning. I began to feel like I wasn't alone. I decided to ask a local about the cabin's history, thinking maybe they could reassure me. But when I mentioned the newspaper article, the man's face went pale. He quickly changed the subject, brushing off my questions. "It's just old news," he said, but the way he avoided my eyes told me more. That's when the paranoia really set in. I couldn't sleep, kept waking up to the slightest noise. The more I tried to act normal, the stranger the townspeople became. They knew things about me, things I hadn't told anyone. They started showing up at the cabin, uninvited, with flimsy excuses. A basket of fruit, a pie, or just checking in. Their eyes were too sharp, their smiles too wide. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop it. Finally, I decided to leave. I packed my bags, threw them in the car, and tried to drive away. But the roads twisted in ways I didn't remember. No matter which way I turned, I ended up back at the cabin. My phone had no signal, and the few cars I saw on the road just slowed down to watch me with that same eerie smile. Panic set in. I was trapped. Every attempt to escape led me back to that cursed place. The cabin that felt like a prison. The town that felt like a trap. I stayed up that night, barricading myself inside, waiting for them to come. I knew they would. The townspeople had done this before, and they would do it again. I was just the next name on their list. Around midnight, the first knock came. Soft, almost polite. Then another, louder. Soon, they were pounding on the doors and windows, their voices calling out, too friendly, too cheerful. "Come out, come out. We just want to talk." But I knew better. Their smiles no longer hid their intentions. I don't remember how I found the strength, but I ran. I grabbed my keys and darted out the back door, running blindly through the woods. I heard them following, their footsteps too close behind, but I didn't look back. Somehow, I made it to the main road. A passing truck stopped, the driver an outsider like me, not part of whatever horror this town held. I begged him to drive, and he did, not asking questions. I didn't look back, not even once, until we were miles away. Now, back in the safety of my home, the nightmare seems almost unreal, but the scars on my arms from the branches that whipped me as I ran, and the old newspaper I brought back with me, they're real. I wonder how many others never made it out of that cabin. And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear those knocks again, soft and polite, just outside my door. I got the call late in the afternoon, a raspy voice on the other end telling me that the missing person I had once tried to find was still alive. The voice was shaky, desperate, saying the person was held near a remote cabin deep in the woods. Before I could ask any questions, the line went dead. It had been years since I last worked on that case, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. Maybe it was guilt or just curiosity, but I found myself heading out to the location without much thought. The drive took hours, and as I got closer, the trees grew thicker, taller. The road became nothing more than a dirt path. The sun was already sinking, casting long shadows across the road. By the time I reached the cabin, it was almost dark. The place was quiet, too quiet. The cabin looked abandoned, with paint peeling off the walls, and the windows were dark, as if they hadn't seen light in a long time. There was something off about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I parked the car and stepped out, my eyes scanning the area. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the air felt heavy, thick with a sense of unease. I reached for my flashlight and moved towards the cabin, the beam cutting through the dim light. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior. The smell hit me first, damp wood and something else, something metallic. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, a lamp lay shattered on the floor, and there were marks on the walls as if someone had struggled. It was clear that something bad had happened here. I moved through the small space, careful with each step. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the rustling of leaves outside, my own breath. In the far corner of the room, something caught my eye. There was a rug, slightly out of place, and underneath it, a trap door. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled the rug away and yanked the door open. A staircase led down into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had come this far. The air was cold as I descended, and the smell grew stronger. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, soundproofed room. It was too quiet down there, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're not alone even when you are. Then I saw them, a person chained to the wall, their clothes dirty and torn, eyes wide with fear. It was the missing person, but they were barely recognizable, thin and weak, as if they had been down there for a long time. I moved quickly, trying to free them, but the chains were strong and I had to find something to break them. As I searched the room, I found more than I bargained for. There were old photos showing other people, all looking just as desperate as the person in front of me. There were recordings, tapes that I didn't dare listen to, but I knew what they were. This wasn't the first time someone had been held down here. Panic set in as I realized the kidnapper might still be close. Maybe they were watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on getting the person out. I found a rusty tool and began working on the chains, trying to break them as fast as I could. The person was trembling, their eyes darting to the staircase as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps above, slow and deliberate. The kidnapper was back. My heart pounded in my chest as I worked faster, the chains finally giving way with a loud snap. I grabbed the person, pulling them up the stairs as quietly as possible. but every step felt like it echoed, like it was giving us away. We reached the top, and I peered out into the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a shadow moving outside. The kidnapper was close, too close. I motioned for the person to stay low as we slipped out through the back, moving as fast as we could towards the car. The night was dark, but I could feel eyes on us, watching. Just as we reached the car, I heard a shout from behind. The kidnapper had seen us. I pushed the person into the passenger seat and jumped into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the narrow path. I could see headlights behind us getting closer. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to go faster. But the road was rough, the trees looming on either side like dark sentinels. It felt like the nightmare was never going to end, like we were trapped in some kind of twisted game. Then a gunshot rang out, loud and sharp. The car swerved, and I fought to keep it on the road. My mind raced, wondering if we had been hit, if the person next to me was still alive. But there was no time to check, no time to think. I just kept driving, the sound of the engine and the pounding of my heart the only things I could focus on. The headlights behind us faded into the distance, but the sense of dread didn't leave. Even as we finally reached the main road, the feeling of being hunted lingered. I didn't stop until we were miles away, my hands still gripping the wheel tightly. As I finally pulled over, I turned to look at the person beside me. They were shaking, their eyes wide with fear, but they were alive. We had escaped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not really. The memory of that basement, the photos, the tapes, they would stay with me forever. And somewhere out there, the kidnapper was still alive, still hunting. The story doesn't have a clean ending because some nightmares never truly end.